What you see before you is the first bed slinger that runs Klipper firmware as stock. This is the Biqu Hurakan, and this is about to get interesting. Let's go. I didn't misspeak just then. This is the first Klipper bed slinger style printer. It's actually the second Klipper stock printer. It was beaten to the stock Klipper printer title by the FL Sun V400 that came out around June, although you may still struggle to get hold of one. We'll talk about the V400 in a moment. The Biqu Hurakan is bold, blue, and in some ways a little aggressive looking. It has the aesthetics of a printer that means business. It's absolutely not inspired by a car with the same-ish name. To run over the features, pun not intended, the Hurakan is a single-screw Bowden extruder-based printer with the usual aluminium extrusion and roller wheel configuration. Functionally, above the base, it follows the classic Ender 3 design, with the exception of a few features, the LED lighting, which, yes, of course you can change the colour of, and the extruder is metal, which is definitely welcome, and the filament sensor, which also improves the filament path compared to an Ender so it doesn't hit the greasy screw. Of course, you also have the new bed probe, which is unlike anything we've seen before, at least if you are to believe the marketing. Bed tensioners on X and Y and a really good PEI surface make up the rest of the top half of the printer, and also noting that the bed has adjustment wheels with blue springs, presumably to match the colour scheme, although blue springs are normally stiffer than yellow ones, so that does make a difference. Not that it should hugely matter with auto bed levelling in place. That's enough of the top half of the printer though. For now, we'll take it apart in a moment. We need to look at the bottom half next. This is where the good stuff is. The front of the printer has no less than 2 memory card slots, but neither of these do what you probably expect them to. One of them fits the micro SD that comes with the printer, and this contains the Linux OS that runs Klipper on the host, but we'll look at that in a moment. The other SD card slot that's a full-size SD card slot is, well, I'm not entirely sure. It's not referred to in the manual, and it's not referred to in the manual for the board itself either. I think it's used solely to flash firmware to the MCU itself, which will be the STM32 chip. Well, that's my best guess, which is odd because you could probably do that through the pins internally over serial, but we'll skim over that and we'll just call it the broadly ignore slot. In fact, Biqu could have done well to put these slots at the back or the side to avoid confusion, because the OS card should not be removed while the printer is on, just as you wouldn't remove a Raspberry Pi card while it's on. So while you can add G-code print files to the OS card, there is a partition for it. I wouldn't recommend it. The easiest offline way to do that is presumably because I don't, but as we look at the rear of the printer, there's 2 USB ports, and according to the manual, you could put a USB stick in there with model files on and print from those. The other port on the rear of note is the one marked SPI, and this is for the AdXL, which, if that's too many acronyms for you, I will cover it shortly. On the front of the printer we have the LCD, which looks pretty normal, but of course it's controlled by the CB1 Raspberry Pi type chip on the board rather than what would normally be the MCU on a Marlin printer. The reason I say this is because this makes it not only configurable on the device if you're hardcore enough, but I'm also afraid to say that at times, because it's not a real-time operating system, presumably, I can't think of any other reason why this is happening, but it gets a bit laggy and it can ignore your inputs. The menus here contain a lot of the usual kinds of options, but broadly, I don't think you'll want to use it if you can help it, mainly because of how it occasionally just decides not to respond to your input. It's convenient for some things like setting the Z offset, but for anything else it's mostly just a display to read for print progress and so on, which in itself is handy. You have to of course recognise that Klipper itself doesn't require a screen. In fact, it's not really designed to run with a screen. I realise that screens on Klipper machines are becoming more common and more popular, but you really don't need it. It's not essential. What you really want to use instead is the Mainsail web interface. The more Klipper you know, the less you have to rely on the screen, and the more console commands you can presumably use if you can remember them. And I'm very inexperienced at Klipper myself, so I'm slowly learning it too. but most things are done via the console commands or the web interface. I will say that I find the Mainsail interface more frustrating on the Hurakan than I did on the FLSun V400, because the FLSun really had the macros nailed down for usability. On the V400 we had macros and menus designed for everything that the user probably needs, and the experience was super smooth. But on the Hurakan the configuration is more basic, so you have to fall back on at least some Klipper knowledge or Googling to get the answer you need. Mainly my struggle personally revolved around setting the Z offset. I still don't think I fully understand how the Z offset works on this printer. You can set it in the menu, or you could set it and press save on Mainsail. Either there's some bugs around this, or I don't fully understand how it's working, but I had a fair bit of trouble getting the printer to retain the correct Z offset. It was behaving so strangely that I just couldn't figure out what it was doing. I generally just kind of mess about with it until it works, and then I leave it. I guess this is probably just a teething issue because the machine is new. Speaking of teething issues, the reason this review is so much later than it would normally be for a new printer, even though I've had the printer for quite some time now, I had a huge problem with the machine when it first arrived. It would stop mid-print on around 1 in 5 prints, with what would appear to be a timing error. Of course, this was a massive concern, as you can imagine, but to cut a long story short, I did what I always do in these cases, and I worked with BigTreeTech to solve it. It was probably fixed within about 3 weeks, I think, possibly less. I wasn't really tracking the timeline. This fix, of course, was an OS update. But of course, what this meant, because this was a sporadic issue, I had to try and reproduce it after that to prove that the problem's gone away, and so that took quite a lot of weeks. I can confirm that it has not happened since, and I've printed a lot of stuff since. So that was a story. Anyway, I guess it shows that Biqu do fix their problems. It was a pretty big problem, so I imagine they would want to fix it, because I think all reviewers may have been having the problem. Some of them had already updated to the latest firmware, so the problem disappeared and they didn't necessarily track that that was the cause. But who knows, maybe they can sort out the laggy screen issue in a future update as well. Anyway, moving past that minor rant, it's time to open this thing up, I think. After all, it surely contains things that we have not seen inside a printer before, including a board pinout diagram on the back of the metal case. I am impressed. Biqu absolutely did not need to do this, but they did do it, and that is really cool. I would say it's an Easter egg for those of us who go inside the printer, but I find it hard to imagine that you'd buy a printer like this and never consider opening it up. I guess they knew that, and that's why it's there. Inside we have the Manta, which is, I think, maybe the successor to the Octopus. I'm not sure. Looking at the file name of the PDF, anyone's guess, but it's the relatively new board from BigTreeTech that supports the Pi Compute Module CM4 or the CB1, which is their own version. As the manual points out in a hilariously blunt style, the CM4 is perpetually out of stock. The specs are also in the manual, and this is, by the way, the manual for the Manta board, not the Hurakan itself. I'll link all this below, but it's not hard to find this stuff. The MCU, which is the bit that does the actual stepper control and stuff, that's an STM32, which is physically attached to the Manta board. The CM1 contains the ARM chip, which is the more powerful half that controls the Klipper host and the Mainsail stuff, if you know the website. And this is essentially a full Linux environment on this tiny little board here. We should be used to that because obviously this is all standard Raspberry Pi stuff, but still it's quite funny the disproportionate size of the more powerful bit and the less powerful bit, but there you go. And yes, you could run other stuff on the CM1 if you wanted to, like home automation. I might do that for a laugh at some point, have the Biqu Hurakan controlling my Hue lights. It would be quite funny, I think, to me at least. You can see that there are ferrules on the incoming mains wires, but not on the bed heater wires. This is weird. They are sadly tinned. I think if you get this printer, you'd probably want to tin those. I don't think there's any concern about the hot end wires. You'll see why in a moment. I have had a few people recently ask why this is important. Well, here's why. The infrared camera here shows the wires getting, well, let's not get too excited. They're getting warm, not hot. Barely above body temperature, in fact, in use. Look at the scale on the left. But the problem with solder is that it's got a fairly low melting point, and so it would be better if the wires were bare copper. As I understand it, the solder can kind of creep over time, which leads to the possibility that the screw terminals might become a bit loose, which leads to increased resistance, and that leads to the heat becoming significantly higher than you see here. Here's more cool IR footage, though. In fact, while we're doing the IR thing, let's look at the bed. The bed has 2 heat zones, which is not the first time this has been done, but it's relatively unheard of. The switch at the back of the bed turns the outer zone on and off. With both LEDs on, you can see the whole bed is on. Well, you can't see, but with the IR camera, you can see. This is the whole bed on, and this is with the center bit on. The downside to this, if I show you a few images with the range set correctly, is you can see the bed temperature is not terribly uniform. I think this is probably workable, but for very large models you might suffer with that temperature at the edge of the bed. It's, I think about 5 degrees lower than the center. In real terms, I didn't notice any problems here, and I think this is mainly because the PEI bed is very, very good at sticking. It's a different colour to usual, and worth noting it's double-sided, which is brilliant. I think it's just from the base steel being black, the reason why its colour is black, but it also performs way better than any other PEI sheet I've had before, and I can't answer why. This printer and the Neptune 3 Pro both have really good PEI sheets, and I still don't know why. We should look at the Toolhead. It seems weird calling it that, it's just a hot end on wheels after all. It's not too tricky to open, and it is a pretty chunky looking heatsink with a custom heat block there too. All looks quite fancy for a Bowden. It's worth noting that it appears to be fully PTFE lined, and the max temperature of 260 is... it has the blue tubing, but I wouldn't personally go over 240 with this one. Dual cooling fans and a pretty neat heatsink fan make this quite a nice setup though. Also notice there's 2 surface mount LEDs too. They don't really give off a lot of light, but they are there. Moving on to print quality and print speed, these kind of go hand in hand. I think first and foremost, it is really hard to make determinations on print quality on a printer like this. Not least because it's running Klipper. I mean, that didn't stop me with the V400 after all, but mainly because so much of the tuning is left to the user. Sure enough, you can just assemble it and start printing, but at what speed? With what profile? At the time of review, I had to use the Cura profile for an older Biqu printer, which isn't even the Hurakan, and of course it's not running Klipper, and while I'm sure some tuned profiles will follow, it felt like the profiles were just not fast enough to be taking advantage of the clipperness of the printer. Speaking of quality though, Biqu included in my printer the AdXL add-on, which I believe is an optional extra for people who are buying this printer. This is an accelerometer on a chip which allows you to do that thing known as input shaping, which is also known as the more parsable resonance compensation. The manual goes into how to do this, and it's pretty simple to follow along. You attach it to the x-axis and it wiggles the printer around a bit. You attach it then to the bed and it wiggles that around a bit. You store both these values and it supposedly prints better afterwards. Optionally, if you want to see some fancy graphs, you can refer to the Klipper documentation and run the commands they specify, and it will generate 2 images on the file system that you have to use your Linux knowledge to get off. You use SSH file transfer. I think these make sense. Do they make sense? The least wiggly line, I think, is a model of the input shaping algorithm that it chose to use, at least. Luckily, these graphs are just eye candy. You don't need them. The manual goes into exactly as much depth as you need to apply these changes. Either way, it wouldn't be right not to have a before and after, and of course I do. I think this is pretty profound, actually, so it kind of is evident that you should not really buy this machine without buying the optional AdXL, unless of course you already have one with the right plug on it, but I assume that they don't normally come with the right plug on, so the easiest option is to buy Biqu's own when you buy the printer, and I would advise that because, well, look at the difference. This review has gone on long enough, so I want to wrap it up, I think. There's a lot more that I could have covered, but I'm really not into editing long reviews. I guess they might end up in other videos in the future. So what do I think? Well, this is a really hard machine to make a call on. This is a machine for tinkerers for sure, at least in my opinion. A totally new user to 3D printing might be able to deal with it just fine. In fact, it does print out of the box, but it's what to do when it goes wrong or when you want to do something that it doesn't come with. And I think that's one of the strange things here. Normally when recommending a 3D printer, you might say if you've had X years of 3D printing knowledge or some such, but in this case, even 10 years of operating Marlin-based printers or dealing with G-code or something like that, it's not only going to get you so far if you don't know basic Linux commands, or I would say actually some reasonably advanced Linux commands. This is, for example, a machine for a software developer regardless of 3D printing experience, or a machine for someone who wants to get into Klipper but doesn't want to have to actually install the hardware. It's a machine for someone who's been eyeing up the Manta boards and thinking, that would be cool, but I don't want to have to mod my own printer. I think it's actually priced very well for this kind of user, and of course it's designed to be upgraded and modded, and that is why it's been aimed at these kinds of users. If you don't like the Bowden, and honestly, who does like Bowden, then you can plan an upgrade to a direct drive like Biqu's H2 thingy, which is honestly almost a no-brainer upgrade on this machine. I'll probably do it myself at some point. So there you go, what do you think? Is the Hurakan something you would consider? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you next time for something equally clippery. Maybe. Thank you for watching. Oops.